Hi my friend, in this video we're going to be making a Ravey tech house song inspired by Tony ROMERA and STEPPA's song, Dance to the Music. And we're going to find out if we can do this in under 5 hours of in-session time using the 80-20 rule of house music. And what you're listening to right now is the track that we'll be working on, and what you're seeing right now is the Ableton project file that we'll be working on. In particular, what we're going to be doing is going one by one through these different groups here. So we're going to start off by going through the drums, then the bass, and then all of the melodic elements like the synths and vocals, before then dragging this out and creating the full arrangement from left to right. All in all, this song did take me about 5 hours of in-session or in-studio time, which I'm pretty happy with in terms of speediness. And if you need help finishing songs faster as well, I've made you a free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that I use to completely finish one song per week. Visit the link that's in the description or on screen now to grab the ultimate song finishing toolkit completely for free. And with that said, let's jump into this. Alright. So first off, let's start with the kick. So in terms of the pattern, it's just a pretty simple 4 on the 4 kick pattern on the 1, 2, 3, 4. Where things get a little bit more interesting is the sound design here for this kick. So what I did is, if you look at the bottom here, you can see that the sample is Dance to the Music extended mix and a bunch of numbers. And so what I did was simply dropped the actual song in here, Dance to the Music extended mix, as you can see right here. And I found a section of the song where the kick was playing, or just the drums were playing, and cut that off, and then just dragged it into a simpler in Ableton. And so when you're doing this, what I'd recommend is, ideally, if you have the extended mix, it's useful because you might want to look at the intro, and sometimes you might want to look at the outro, because sometimes there might be that kind of high pass filtered effect on the intro. You want to try to find a nice full sounding kick. Then in terms of what I did in terms of the sound design here, is when you drop this into simpler, if you go over to controls, what you want to do is click on envelope, and you want to bring the envelope all the way up. And so then what you can do then is adjust the frequency to remove any of the nonsense there. So if I just go ahead and zero this out and then bring the frequency up, this is originally what the sample sounded like. And so when you don't have the envelope up, if I go back, it has that kind of the filter rolled off kind of sound, which isn't as effective as when you just bring in the envelope. It's going to preserve kind of that top end transient and sound pleasant and a lot nicer. So that's kind of the idea there. Drop it into a simpler, bring up the envelope a bunch, and then drop down the frequency to taste, so that you're getting rid of a bunch of the other noise that might be showing up there. I think in this case it's some kind of white noise, that kind of stuff. Then other than that, the only other stuff that I'm doing here is I did add a bit of the drive and the filter here. So I just brought up the drive. I changed the filter type to SMP. It's just one that I kind of like the sound of. And then using a transient designer, I brought up the attack a bit to get kind of that punch, and then brought down the sustain a bit to kind of tighten up the sound a little bit. Other than that, what I do have going on here on the EQ is I have shelf filtering out the top end at about 500 hertz, and this is the way I've heard about it, some way to do it this way, and I've tested it, and it's nice, as opposed to always using the harsher like this, which you can hear it there. It kind of cuts off too much of it and doesn't sound natural. So when you use the shelf instead, or where was the shelf? When you use the shelf instead, it can have a bit more of a natural sounding way to remove some of the top end, if you'd like to remove some of the top end. Other than that, the main thing, and this is going to be one of the biggest tips here, is when you have a reference track in your DAW here, what you can do is set it up so that you can flick between the actual track and your track, and you can choose your sounds and set the right volumes, and that's going to get you 80-20. The 20% of the effort is going to get you 80% of the way there by using a reference track to pick your sounds and set the volume. So really, there's not a lot of processing going on here. Main thing is sound selection, and then dialing in the volume while jumping back and forth between the reference track. Then moving on, the next thing that I added in was this open hi-hat. And so what we got going on here, if we jump into the MIDI pattern, is what I did was, usually I'll start off with kind of, as I highlighted here, that every other beat kind of open hi-hat classic sound. And I layered 2 different hat sounds on there, and then also layered on this kind of shaker sound, and then ended up adding a little bit of a pattern with it as well. And so that's what you kind of see here. In terms of the sound selection, again, what I was doing was jumping back and forth between the reference. I could kind of hear like a kind of a shaker or something like that in there. So that's what I aimed to recreate there with the open hi-hat. In terms of the processing here, just rolling off some of the lows, as you can see, around 284 hertz. I'm using a Transient Designer once again to remove some of the sustain to kind of tighten up the sound a bit. And then using a 1-knob saturator, just Ableton saturator, I just attached it to this kind of macro, so it's just a little easier to use, adding in a bit of saturation, and that is just about it. Next up, I added in these additional hi-hats. I'll just bring up the volume here so you can hear. There's a couple different sounds, and it's kind of creating that little groove. So if we look at the pattern, this is a little bit of what it looks like. We have a couple different sounds being triggered here. And generally what I'll do with this is maybe start with the first like half a bar, or the first bar in general, and then build this out, and then on the second half just make slight adjustments so there's a bit of like a call and response. In particular, it can be useful to also do something like this. So similar to the open hi-hat, start off with just the offbeat kind of sound, reinforcing the open hi-hat and giving it so that there's still that offbeat sound when you don't have the open hi-hat in the arrangement section of the when building of the track. And that's kind of a look at what we have here. Again, kind of just jumping back and forth, trying to get that shuffle and choose the right sounds. I think in this part, this is kind of where I started to take into my own direction so I could slowly start building out my own track. In terms of the sound design, we're removing a bunch of the lows, shelving out a little bit of the highs, tightening it up a little bit by removing some of the sustain with the Transient Designer, and then also again adding in a bit of saturation, filling out the sound a bit with 1-knob saturation. The next thing I added in was the snare. And if we have a look at the MIDI, it's just on the 2-4-2-4, classic kind of placement for a snare. In terms of the sound design, again, and with everything, is flicking back and forth and listening to the snare. And you can kind of flick it in the time, trying to land it so it's musical, kind of help you figure out the right sound and placement and all that kind of stuff. With the snare, I find you usually kind of like listening more kind of you might hear a snare and a clap. Usually the clap is a little bit wider and the snare is a bit more down the center for when you're trying to listen to it yourself. So again, main thing is sound selection and choosing the right volumes, because as you can see here in terms of the processing, there's nothing going on here, absolutely nothing. So that said, next up is the clap, so we'll add that in. And you can hear there, it's kind of adding a little more of the high end and a little bit of width. And so flicking back and forth. So you can hear, again, sound selection and volumes is really the main thing, because other than that, if we look at the pattern, what we just have going on here is just on the 2 and 4, just like the clap. And then in terms of the processing, removing some of the lows and adding in a bit of saturation to add some fullness to the sound. And then lastly, just a little bit of this 1-knob wider plugin, pushing it out of the middle, pushing it to the sides. Next up, what I usually like to do after that is, I find these are kind of like the core sounds. You're gonna have your kick, your open hi-hat, your hi-hats, snare, and clap. And then after that, what I usually like to do is add in top loops, maybe some kind of drum breaks, to add a bit of character and groove to it. So if I turn this on, you can hear it there. Let me bring up the volume so you can really hear it. And what I did here was just I found a drum break, just searching through Splice, something that sounded kind of cool, and nestled it in so it's not picking up too much of the sound. It's really just adding a little bit of extra here. This is a look at the sample. And then in terms of the processing, we're removing a bunch of the lows to make room for the kick and the bass, shelving out a bit of the high so it's not, so just kind of mix it in a little bit. And then I do have a 1-knob sidechain, which is just ducking it away again from the kick and kind of giving it a bit of a groove. And then using that 1-knob width plugin here to just push things again to the sides a little bit, like And sometimes I'll layer in several different top loops. So this is the first one that I added in, and then this is the next one I added in. And you can hear this is a little bit more percussion-y with a hat layered in there as well. You can have a look at the sample here. Again, just looking up drum breaks, that kind of thing on Splice. In terms of the processing, removing some of the lows, shelving out some of the highs, using the 1 knob sidechain, 1 knob saturation, and then width again. Just kind of slowly building up, and you can hear it's slowly starting to add a lot more character to the drums. We can jump back and forth. I think there's still a bit more kind of shaker sound in the reference, and so I believe that's what we're going to probably be adding in here. Yeah, so if we bring up the volume here, kind of a bit more of a shakery kind of vibe. Again, nestled in. I think if we compare them, there's still a bit more of a shaker sound, so I probably could have layered this in a little bit higher in terms of increasing the volume, but kind of happy with how this sounds. In terms of the processing, again, removing some of the lows, keeping that all space free for the kick and the bass. And then a bit of 1 knob sidechain, a bit of 1 knob saturation, and a bit of 1 knob width to bring things out. And then I guess really that is a look at the drums. And if we just go ahead and listen to everything in context, you can hear how it all sounds together. Boom. And that's it. That's kind of it there, right? So the main things I do want you to take home here is having a reference track so that you can, as you're building out your drums, you can be choosing the right sounds and setting the right levels. And again, that's going to be kind of the 80-20 rule of really nailing solid sounding drum mix. In addition to that, what you can do is also steal samples, like how we stole the kick. You can do the same thing for snares and hi-hats as well, by finding sections of the song that don't have a lot of musicality or other elements or other layers. It's going to be a lot easier to extract things so that you can use it in your own compositions. Alright. So when it comes to the bass, usually something that I like to always do is start with a sub track. And basically, the reason why is this is very similar to the idea of when you're creating chords or figuring out a melody. Sometimes you might start with, say, a piano or a guitar, and because it's such a uncharacteristic, kind of simple sounding instrument, you can really focus on getting the pattern or figuring out the notes, and really focusing on getting that right first without getting too sucked into sound design or any of that kind of aspect of things. So what we're listening to right now is the drums and the sub bass, and we'll start off with the pattern. I'll give you a look at this. So I'm guessing what I figured out here was that the song was in A minor or D minor, and the way you can find this out is using something like Google. Really type in the song name, drop it into Google, and also type in key and BPM. You'll be able to figure it out. But really the main thing I did was, once getting a rough idea of what the key was, the main thing is that I've mapped the S key to the solo button of this track right here, and I've dropped the Dance to the Music Extended Mix song into Ableton and set up so I can flick between the reference track as well as my track. And so simply just by kind of just jumping back and forth and playing around with different notes, I was able to kind of land on what you see here. And the main thing I was kind of going for is, you can probably tell, is that kind of rolling bass sound. So let's listen to the reference. I feel like the original probably even has less notes. I went for something a little bit more, I guess, technical, because also at this point I want to start off by copying that vibe, but slowly adjust it a bit so that I can eventually have this as my own track that I'll be able to release. In terms of the sound design, what I have is this little Ableton rack that I've set up here. All this is operator and EQ and some sidechain and saturation all built into it, so that I'm able to very easily have a sub sound, which is just like a sine wave, and then add in different levels of drive and harmonic saturation, those kinds of things, to kind of give the sub sound a little bit more character, kind of give that Ravey sound a little bit as well, and also make sure that you can actually hear it on like laptop speakers and crappy headphones. And that's kind of the idea there. Again, we're dialing in a bit of 1 knob sidechain here, so that it kind of has that pumping sound as well. And then I do have an EQ at the end having a couple different ways that I'm shaping the high end. One is just a classic, removing some of the top end with a low pass filter, but then also using the shelf to get rid of some of the low mids without getting rid of it completely. I wanted some mids to shine through, but I wanted to tame it somewhat. And the reason that I usually like to have the subs separate from the rest of the bass sound is so that you can really focus in on making sure that the low end's really tight, making sure that it sounds nice and low and full and beefy and all that kind of stuff, while making room for the upper mids and highs, because then I'll usually have a separate mid track, and we'll go over that next. So what I have here is this separate MIDI track, and in this you'll see that there's absolutely no MIDI being played. And the way that I like to do this, let me actually turn on this bass sound and bring up the volume quite a bit so you can hear it. So yeah, it's a kind of adding that dirty top end, but I've layered it in quite a bit. And so what I've done here is, if you set a MIDI track to in like this, where my mouse is, and then you go up to the top, instead of all ins, if you select the track that you want it to follow the MIDI notes, in this case it's the subs track. If you click subs, it's gonna take the MIDI here and route it into this track. And what's useful about this is, for one, you don't have to worry about copy and pasting the MIDI over to the other tracks. And in addition to that, if you make a change to, say, the sub track, you won't have to duplicate that work over to your mid bass track. It's just gonna automatically pipe in the MIDI track, the MIDI notes into this track. So it's like a nice way to work around that, I would say. So in my particular instance, what I like to do with this is usually have the MIDI pitch device, because sometimes what you might find is that for the sub track, maybe those notes are too low or too high when it's being automatically routed into your mid bass track. So by having something like this, you can see I had to pitch it up 24 semitones for it to make sense for the sound of the mid bass. In terms of the sound of the mid bass, what I'm using is a sampler device where I simply, this guy, Trillion is a cool bass VST, but it's quite a heavy load. So I sampled a different bit of pitches, notes from that VST, dropped it into an Ableton sampler here, and that way I'm using a sampled instrument essentially. And for my personal style of music, I really like kind of like that bass guitar sound. Maybe it's because I used to play in bands and stuff like that. For you can make it bass guitar sound. If you want your mid bass to be like a signature mid bass to be synth sound or a particular synth or whatever it is, like, I would recommend trying to find some kind of signature sound for some of these things. Makes it easier so that when you are building tracks, you just reach for your signature sound. And then also, as you're building a fan base, some of these things are gonna start to, it's patterns that your listeners will be able to assign to you as an artist. So for me, that's the bass guitar sound. Other than that, I do have a bit of the circuit SMP in terms of the saturation here, bring up the drive a little bit so it adds a bit more of that grit. Very important here when it comes to the mid bass, what you do want to do is you want to roll off a bunch of the lows. So at around 200 hertz, I'm cutting off a bunch of the lows because I want the lows to be mainly coming from that like pure subby sine wave bass sound that we're coming from the sub track here. Other than that, just rolling off a little bit of the highs with a shelf so that it's a bit more of a natural removal of the high end frequencies. Sometimes a low pass filter can be a bit harsh. Then we're running it into a Transient Designer, which is basically removing some of the attack of the transient, so it sounds a little bit more, less harsh, you would say, for each one of the notes, and then also bringing back a bit of the sustain, so it's tightening up the notes as well. Other than that, I have this one knob width plugin, so basically using this to push the mid bass sound a bit more to the side, so it's a bit more of a fuller stereo sound, and also leaving room in the middle for the sub to really come through. Other than that, we are running it through a one knob sidechain, so it's basically just ducking on quarter notes instead of having to route it to the kick, which I just find easier to do. And that really is a look there at the bass. Other than that, we're running it into a group where I just have a K clip on here. It's a clipper plugin, and just trying to aim for not too much clip sound, but like around a decibel, maybe two, as you can see here. And that's really a look at the bass. All right. So what we're listening to right now is just the drums and bass soloed, and we're going to slowly build up all of the individual synth tracks and vocal tracks in the order that I created them. So one thing that I do want to mention right away is that up at the top here, I do have the Dance to the Music extended mix actually dropped into my DAW and set it up so that when I press the S key on my keyboard, it'll flip between that song and what I'm creating. And this is really tip number one, having a reference track and flicking between it, because it's really helpful for selecting the right notes, choosing the right sounds, and really the 80-20 rule here is getting the right volumes set up to a reference track. That's going to get you such a polished sound quickly. So let's jump into this. First, we're going to start off with the synths. So one of the first sounds I have is this. Oops, I didn't want to solo it, so I'm going to turn it on. Alright. So, what we're listening to here is we have the drums and the bass, and I'm going to slowly start adding in each of the tracks in order that I created them. But one of the tips I want to show you right away is if you see here, we actually have the Dance to the Music extended mix dropped into the DAW, and what I've done is I've turned it off and set up the S key on my keyboard so that whenever I press it, it's going to solo this reference so I can flick between it and my track. And this way, what you can do is you can flick back and forth so that you can choose the right notes, select the right sounds, and select the right volumes as you're building in these tracks. The sound selection, the notes, and the volumes is really going to get you 80% of the way there. And doing it against a reference track is going to really be that shortcut to making sure that you have a really polished sound. So, first sound we have here is this kind of rave stab. And so, let's have a look at the MIDI. What I did was flicking back and forth. So you can hear it's similar, that kind of interesting little back note or whatever you might call that. So what I did was I started off by kind of mimicking that similar note placement, and then I changed up some notes, added in some kind of like call and response, because ultimately I wanted to start by getting the right kind of vibe and then take it from there in a slightly different direction so that I could make it a more original track. In terms of the sound design, the star of the show here is this really cool plugin called Rave-Generator, and it basically just has a bunch of interesting samples, sampled chords, those kind of things, from classic house songs and all that kind of stuff. It's completely free, so I would definitely recommend checking it out. Another alternative is you could load samples of chord stabs from Splice into a simpler and trigger it there, because as you can see here, a full chord is being sounded even though just a single note's being played. And this is kind of really the key to that Ravey sound, because what's happening is, as you may or may not know, some songs are usually in minor or major, and so if you're playing a chord and it's just a sample of a chord, when you play different notes, it's gonna preserve that minor sound and might have some kind of off notes, and that is kind of why that Ravey sound kind of works. And that's also why you need to be careful with these sounds, because since as you're playing different chords and resampling that chord into different pitches, some of the notes may or may not work. It could be a pleasant, cool Ravey sound, and it could sound kind of chaotic and crappy, so definitely gotta be careful with that. But then in terms of the rest of the sound design, I basically just found a house stab, just played through the presets, to be completely honest, is how I ended up finding this. And then I'm removing a bunch of the lows to make room for the kick and the bass and kind of get rid of some of that lower and muddy kind of sound. Then I'm using a one knob Transient designer here. Sorry, a little sick. Bringing up the attack, so transients being emphasized a bit more, being pushed out a bit more, and then removing some of the sustain so that the decay of the sound is tighter, so it's a bit more of a snappier sound. And I'm running it into a program VST called Portal. It's found an interesting sound, and just dialed it in a little bit. This is what it sounds like all the way. Wild, right? So I just brought it in a little bit to add a little bit more character and weirdness. That's probably just personal preference. That's not something that the original artist would probably do. And I'm running into a one knob sidechain, so it's just doing kind of a volume pumping effect, similar to sidechaining to the kick, but I prefer to just have it pumping to a quarter note. It's just a lot faster and easier to do it. And then a little bit of one knob saturation using Ableton Saturator, just macro to one knob. I'm going to add in, make the sound a bit more full, and come out a little bit more. And then I'm using this one knob width plugin to push things a bit to the left and right, make space in the middle, and then also kind of get that stereo sound. Next up we have this right here. Let's bring up the volume. And so this is a bit of a weirder technique. What I'm using here is a cool program called Synth, and unfortunately it won't show you exactly how it works here, but what I did was I found a section of the song where the synth was kind of playing through here in this break here. Actually, if I just jump to here and solo this out, I grabbed one of these little bits here, and then I dropped that into Synth. And so what Synth lets you do is you can drop any audio into Synth and it'll use AI to try to find a similar sound. So as you can hear, it's not exactly the same as in the audio track, as the original reference track, but it is interesting and unique, and at this point that's kind of what I'm going for. I'm trying to slowly start to deviate from the original reference track so I can, again, build up my own track. Then usually what I do like to do with Synth is run it into the Ableton Spectral Resonator. So if I turn this off and just solo this, so it still sounds good, but with the Spectral Resonator, you can set it so that it's going to receive the MIDI from whatever track you're doing. In this instance, we're doing it from the Rave generator track from before, and it'll kind of push the sound to make sure that it's in the right key. Sometimes with the Synth AI stuff, it'll lose the key in the process of the AI generating the sound. So this can make sure that it stays in key, but then also I'm able to play with like the decay. As you can see here, there's a bit of automation, so it's kind of increasing the decay, making it a bit more of a decayed out sound, more sustained, and then as opposed to a tighter sound, just to kind of add some interest to the track over time. Then other than that, again, removing some of the lows to make sure there's room for the kick and the sub, and then a bit of one knob sidechain, so it's kind of pumping, again making room as well, and then a little bit of the one knob width to push things to the left and right. At one point I have this Corpus come in, just to kind of make the sound interesting. I think it's over here, if you can hear that. That's kind of the weird harmonic kind of stuff. I liked having this in the break. You can hear that. It's cool. Slowly automating the decay so it's more filling up the sound. Kind of a little trick in the arrangement there. And that's that sound. Next up what we have is I added this little funk guitar thing. And essentially I just found some interesting little guitar loop. This is obviously not very much like the wheel back. There's definitely no guitar here in the reference track. So the main thing was I kind of got that original Ravey sound, jumped back and forth between the reference a bunch to make sure that the volumes were appropriate. And then at this point I started taking it away into a more unique direction so that I could actually release it like I mentioned. So I just found a cool guitar loop in Splice, just looked for something that was in the same key. And then what we have here is just moving some of the lows. Again, I'm running this into Tantra, which is just kind of giving it a bit more texture and making it a bit more unique sounding, I would say. So kind of trying to play with the original sample a bit more so it's not just a straight up dropping in of the sample and that's it. Then a bit of one knob sidechain, make it pumping, and that's really it. And then what I did do here is kind of more of an arrangement trick, but the first few bars, 16 bars I believe this is this guitar bit, and then the second is this one. Listen to this. Again, just found a cool little sample. A little more cosmic sounding, that's why I labeled it cosmic. And then that way it'll kind of change back and forth between the two. It's going to sound a little bit more interesting. In terms of the processing, removing a lot more of the lows there. So it's mostly just the highs coming through. Running it through this Tantra preset here, all the way in. Just kind of giving it a bit more of that spacey cosmic vibe. Running it through this one is a really cool plugin, it's completely free. And this can kind of help you get that kind of stuttery stutter house sound, and just play with the attack a little bit so it's a little bit less intense, and dial back the mix again so it's a little bit less intense, and that's kind of giving that cool choppy kind of sound. Again, trying to play with the original sample so it's not just a total just drop in. Other than that, we're doing some 1-up side chain to make it bounce, and make room for the kick, and just up, and a little bit of saturation to fill it out a bit, and then a bit of 1-up with push to the left and right, make it more stereo, make room for the middle there. Other than that, I have this little bit here, which might be hard to hear, so I'll solo it, which is kind of just a little bit of like atmosphere, kind of a bit of a kind of pad sound, and so yeah, you can kind of hear it there. So what that is when I started building up the break, you can hear here, what we do also have is this pad sound. And so what this is I went into whatever this is, Noctua, Venus Theory, Parks on Fire preset, found an interesting pad sound, and then ran that through Valhalla Supermassive and automated the mix so it's getting more and more reverby and interesting over time. And then I noticed that when I pressed like stop, there was this interesting reverb tail, and so what I did was just recorded that and resampled it in, and then put that on the track here, which I just think adds cool ambience, just interesting little character. There's definitely not a lot of pads going on in the original, as you can hear. So again, this is just kind of taking things into a different direction. Let's kind of look at the synths. Let's move over to the vocals. So on the vocals here, I'm going to show you what it sounds like. Found this interesting, your energy kind of sample and slice, just cut it up a little bit, as you can see here. And main thing, pick the sound, jump back and forth between the reference track to get the volumes more or less right. I have it on 2 tracks because this one is just a different way that I played with it. So if I go to, like maybe over here, I have it on a separate track. It's the same pattern play. This one is a little bit more filtered out. I just wanted to kind of play with it on 2 different tracks, just kind of a weird way to do it. That's a look at the vocals, and I did want to show you this as well, because although this sounds kind of cool, it's not exactly the same as the original reference track, but it kind of has that cool Ravey, diva-y kind of sound to it, and I think what I typed in, it says diva here, so I probably looked in like diva vocals, that kind of thing, in Slice. But we go to when the drop kicks in here. I did try a couple other things, and I want to show you this because sometimes it's a process of finding the right vocal sounds and sample sounds. So in this case, one of the first things I tried was this Shaka Khan thing, which sounds terrible, but I was kind of going for that, like, you hear that like repeating sound? I'm kind of going for that, but it sounds off key and awful, so I ended up not going for that. Then I went for this kind of Ariana Grande, but it didn't really fit either. I didn't like that. And then I think I had this too, just cutting up a bunch of weird different sounds, and that didn't sound good either. And ended up going with this kind of energy bit of the vocal line. So just kind of showing you the process of how I got there. Tried a couple different things. It took a while to land on it, but did eventually get there. And that is a look at the vocals and the synth for this one. Alright. So before we go through this entire arrangement from left to right, there are a couple of different kind of concepts that I want to break down for you. So first is when you're going through your arrangements, I think a solid idea is to first build the song vertically. So maybe start with a kick, open hi-hat, snare, clap. You build out all the drums, then you build out the bass, then you build out all the melodic stuff, the synths, and the vocals, all that. You kind of create that original loop. You build it out vertically. And the idea is to then stretch that out horizontally. So then to build out the track horizontally, so you actually have a full structure and arrangement. One of the strongest ways that you can do that is by building out an arrangement track. And so what this is at the top here, you can see I'm using blank MIDI clips to kind of create the different transitions or the different sections of the song. So the intro where the sub comes in, a break, drop, at the end with a build down, an outro, those kind of ideas. Again, another really strong idea is to have a reference track. So right here, we actually have that dance to the music song in here. And what I've done is I've created these dummy clips to actually point out where the big changes in the song are. And then that way, as I'm building out the song and building out horizontally, what I'm able to very, very quickly do is use this arrangement track to figure out what should happen where, how long the intro should be, how long the first drop should be, how long break should be, all that. And usually what I call this concept at the top here is macro transitions. So macro transitions are those larger changes that happen every 16 to 32 bars, sometimes 64 bars, that kind of idea. And you can almost think of it in traditional music writing where it's the verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. Those bigger changes are the macro changes. But in addition to that, it's also important to think of some things like micro transitions. And for me, micro transitions happen every 8 to 16 bars. And so that might be like the first 8 bars, you have just the drums like this. Then in the next 8 bars, you add in the bass or another layer of the drums. Then the next 8 bars after that, you add in another layer of the drums, and slowly adding small changes or taking out small changes every 8 to 16 bars to keep some movement and energy going. In addition to that, micro transitions would be things like this. So I have usually a dedicated effects group. And in here, we have things like crashes. We have reverse crashes, laser sounds, those uplifting riser sounds, those kinds of things, downlifters, sweeps, those things. You want to put those every 8, 16 bars or so, and that's a very simple way to have micro transitions to keep that interest going, keep that movement going, all that. So I just turned it on here, you can kind of have a listen to that. So that said, we're going to go through this track. I'm going to turn off the loop. Right now we are in the first 16 bars, which is the intro. Essentially is mostly just the drums, very few elements here in terms of there's maybe a little bit of kind of a pad sound going on. Nothing too crazy. This is mainly for the DJ to mix things in. And then we have this kind of riser sound coming in as a micro transition and a reverse crash leading into our first macro transition, which is where the sub kicks in. So now we have the bass in, and you heard there was a little laser sound signaling that happening, as well as right before that, the kick dropped out, which is also a nice little micro transition. We have the kind of melodic bits slowly being introduced here throughout this sub part, and as well as the vocals being filtered in slowly as well. Leading into that, we have this micro transition of these like reverse sounds coming in to a macro transition, which is a break. So we had 16 bars of the sub, and now we have 16 bars of the break. The first 8 bars, we've introduced a bunch of the, a lot more of the rave stabs and all that. And we have introduced a bit of a pad. We have these vocals slowly being filtered in. And over here, we have a little 909 roll coming in with addition to a bunch of different little sweeps and reverse sounds. Going into a small little micro transition where we just cut out everything. And now we're into the first drop. Also, I want to point this out, in that break here, the first half the kick was there and it was kind of high passed. And then the second half, as a micro transition again, we reduced the kick completely. So now in this first break, first 16 bars, we have this one kind of guitar loop. Second half, we have this different guitar loop, kind of keep things changing. And we filtered in the vocals over here. And now we're going into the next 16 bars of the drop with a little micro transition right here. A little pause, reverse crash, goes into it with a crash at the beginning and that kind of laser sound. What we've done here is in the second half, change up the chords a bit. They're playing a bit less intensely. And also slowly building in some of this like automation of the decay of this other synth to kind of keep things moving and changing. So now we're going to go into the first big break. We'll have a little drop out of the kick as a micro transition, and then just some little riser sounds. So now we're in the first big break. This break, instead of just 16 bars, it's going over the course of 32. We have the kick in there. I believe it's been high passed. Yeah, we have a little bit of high pass going on, so there's a little bit less energy taking away from the kick. We have the pads coming in, replacing some of the energy that's been lost during this part. The vocals have been pitched down, just kind of changing things up. We have this riser going throughout it, as well as on the master channel. We have a bunch of different things going on here. So this endless smile kind of reverb effect, slowly going over the entire master track, as well as this little riser version of it as well. Slowly bringing in the 909 rolls. You can see in the 32 bars here, we removed all of the drums and changed up the bass, so it's just playing single notes. Slowly bringing up that snare roll, little pause, into the last drop here. At this point, we have both of the guitar loops playing. Before it was one for the first 16 bars and a different one for the second 16 bars. Now we're playing them both at the same time. We also have pads in that weren't there before. The idea usually for the last drop is to have it kind of be the most fulfilling part, the most satisfying. All the elements are in. It's the peak of the moment, and the climax, if you will. Little transition, micro transition here, removing some elements. And now we're in on the last 16 bars of the drop. Kind of starting to build it down, but I've added in a ride. Turn that back on, actually. Which usually is a nice way, as a micro transition, add the ride in, and it brings up the energy. Different reverb swells and white noise sounds and all that kind of stuff. And slowly removed all the guitar bits. So now we're kind of starting to build it down, and then we're moving into the last 16 bars, which is a build down. Maybe DJs might mix into this part. This part, we've gotten rid of the vocals completely. We have a couple of different little laser sounds and stuff like that happening every 8 bars or so. The rave stabs have even been gone. It's mostly just the drums and the bass. The second half of it, playing some sparse little rave sounds here, but mostly you're kind of trying to keep the energy drop down before we go into the last 16 bars, which is the outro, where what we do is we are high passing the kick. We're bringing away some of that energy. You can see here mostly it's just the drums playing. The first 8 bars we have this open hats playing. The micro transition to change things up. After that 8 bars, we remove that, drops the energy further. And what else do we have going on here? That's pretty much. So we're just going to play all the way up until the end. We're going to drop the kick for the last little section as a final little micro transition. And that is the tune. Hello again, my friend. Hopefully you found that video useful. If you'd like to follow along yourself with the 5-step song finishing checklist, there will be a link in the description below where you can get access to that completely for free. And it's going to help you finish your songs a lot faster and better than ever before. If you found this video useful, like and subscribe and all that good stuff. But really the best thing I can do for you is hook you up with that free checklist, so make sure you check that one. Other than that, I'll see you in the next video, my friend. Have a good one.